life is tough. I don't think any of us question that. At any given moment, each one of us is wrestling with some pressure or some pain or some problem or some tension or some trouble. Each one of us are feeling like the walls are coming in one area of our lives. And it can be hard or difficult or maybe even impossible to get excited about life when it feels like the bottom is being pulled out from underneath you. And even so, it can be hard to maintain and nurture our faith. And when we're trying to just breathe under the pressure and the anxieties of those things that we are wrestling with. And that's why we're studying on this book of 1 Peter. On Sunday mornings, we look into this series because it is all about, 1 Peter is all about how we are to live in the middle of those moments that are full of pain and problems. 1 Peter is really just this book, this letter from Peter that is encouraging followers of Jesus who are suffering greatly under pressure. The church of Asia Minor at this time is being persecuted by Rome. We looked at this really early on, but as Peter is writing this letter, and he's now in his 60s, he's a year or two away from his death. He's writing to Christians who have been in the church for 30 years that kind of came to Christ under Jesus himself, and they're now kind of struggling, and they've been pushed out in the diaspora, and they're poor. And Nero is blaming the failings of the empire on them, and so he begins to take Christians and persecute them. And some he lights on fire and puts them in the middle of the street. And in addition to that, there's great poverty that's happening at this time, and that's all in addition to the pains that the church is already feeling just from everyday life. Peter is aware that the problem, the pains, the tension, and trouble can shift us and our faith and our focus. And so Peter begins to write this letter as he looks at these churches that he cares for, these followers of Jesus that he's invested in disciple, and he says, guys, I get it. Life is tough. But this is what we need to do to stay focused. This is what we need to do so we do not succumb to compromise or burn out. And so far in this series, we've looked at we must worship fully, right? Normally, when pain hits, we want to withdraw, and so we must worship fully and not withdraw, not give into our instinct to withdraw. We must surrender fully, not try to hold on to control, but really let God be in control of the moment. We looked at how Peter tells them that they need to focus on nurturing their horizontal relationships because the way they treat others, the way they love for each other or don't love for each other can actually inhibit or affect or limit their vertical relationship. The way that they treat others may actually be inhibiting their ability to be with God's presence. And then he says that, we looked at this last week, we must keep a clear conscience by revering Christ in the middle of pain. Because where we steer our thoughts, steer our direction. And he gave this big talk last week on what it means to keep a clear conscience revered on Christ in the middle of a trial. This morning we're going to see that when we're living under pressure, we more clearly see the kind of world that sin produces. And that God desires for everybody to play in living out God's will. And that may require sharing in His sufferings so that we may be transformed in His glory. So as we've been saying, and as we pick up this morning, we've been saying our series is all about in the seasons that we're under pressure and hiding out because of hard times and painful hurts. We must not bring everything to a halt, right? We must not just stop and run into this kind of habitual escapism, and we must not harm others in return. Instead, we must intentionally learn and commit to what it means to live and love like Jesus by pursuing personal and spiritual formation, doing the work to surrender the places in life that we've kind of we've been hung up, or we're holding on, or maybe we're holding out on something. Let's see what Peter has for us this week. So I encourage you to open your Bibles or your Bible apps to 1 Peter 4, 7 through 11. So we're going to pick up with Peter's letter today. And we're picking up halfway through 1 Peter 4. And kind of what's happened so far up to this point is that Peter begins to list some sins that he believes people fall into when they're under pressure. Now, like you, when we are wrestling with something, we like to distract ourselves, right? I also end like this, right? I mean, how many people would love a good Netflix and binge night when you're feeling stressed, right? Like good just movie night where you just put some movie on after movie night and, you eat some popcorn and some chocolate cake and you distract yourself from whatever's going on. Or maybe it's you want to drive to the beach or to the mountains and just get away from it all. Sometimes we also tend to pick up sins, gossip, or lifestyles that necessarily aren't God-honoring. And so what we see is Peter begins to list those sins and says, guys, listen, when you're under pressure, it's going to mean that you're going to need to suffer with Christ. And don't do it by obligation. I want you to willingly suffer. And secondly, he says, be your own judge. Let the community judge you. Make sure you're ready for when the end comes. Prepare yourself. Make sure that you're staying focused. And so that's kind of where we're picking up in this letter. N.T. Wright says it this way, that Peter is writing that nothing is to be gained from lawless behavior. It merely wastes the time you could have been growing as a human being, discovering more about how God's love can transform you and those around you. That is, after all, what you were here for. And so this is really the spirit of Peter's letter here in 1 Peter 4. Last week we saw he's kind of writing from a fatherly angle. Now he's going to really hit it from a discipling angle. What does it mean to grow as a human being as you're living under pressure so you can discover more of God's love? So 1 Peter 4, 7 through 11. The end of all things is near. Therefore, be alert and sober mind so that you may pray. And above all, love each other deeply because love covers a multitude of sins. Offer hospitality to one another without grumbling. Each of you should use whatever gift you have received to serve others as faithful stewards of God's grace and in its various forms. Now, I just want to pause here for a minute. The end of all things is near. Be alert. Be of sober mind. This passage from Peter as he's writing here really begins to touch on some things he's already touched on. In the first week, we talked about what it means to be alert. In the second week, we talked about what it means to be sober of mind. We've already talked about what it means to work on our horizontal relationships and love each other deeply. What we see Peter doing here is realizing that those themes are really important to how to live under pressure. As they're being persecuted, as their movement, their church movement that is fledging in this poverty and persecution, these are the things that they really need to take to heart. And so he repeats himself. And when he repeats himself, as we see in a little bit here, he actually gives them a new twist, right? For instance, be of sober mind so that you can pray. That so that you can pray is a new information that Peter has thrown onto an old command that it's already said in this letter. Now, as we think about this, there are 4 things that show up in this letter that Peter is writing, that he is calling to them. Now think about the pain and pressures that you're wrestling with in life. Often when we're wrestling with those things, it can feel like the walls are coming down. One of my favorite examples of this, and I know that probably only 1/3 of you have seen this movie, is the movie Star Wars. And in Star Wars, Tim, you're with me, right? In Star Wars, there's this scene in the original Star Wars where they are trying to rescue a princess and they finally get away from the onslaught of attack, and they decide to slide down this trash chute and escape from people that are chasing them. And, they fall into this pile of junk and they're like, whew, made it. We're away from the attack. We're safe. And then all of a sudden, the walls start to shift. It's a trash compactor. And they're stuck. And all 4 walls begin to break the trash apart and break it. And it's coming in closer and closer. And if that's not bad enough, in the middle of this time where the walls feel like they're coming in, there's some type of rat-eating, trash-eating rat snake thing that is in the water with them. And it feels like their doom is there. Folks, think about the pressures that you're wrestling with. When you really focus on them, when you allow them to drive you to that point of anxiety or panic attack, that imagery is exactly what we can feel like. oh man, this situation is just so big. The walls are coming in. The end is near. There's no way that I'm going to be able to wrestle with this. It's too much. That's the exact language that Peter opened this letter with. He said, the end of all things is near, right? It's so crazy out there, folks, that it, without a doubt, is the end of all things. But he doesn't go like, hey, just hold out, God's coming soon. He doesn't say, keep your head up. He doesn't do the things that we like to do and say like, hey, cast your cares on him. It's going to be all right. Peter says something else. As they are in this room where the pressure is great and moving in, it's becoming too much, he raises the bar. And this is where we see the discipleship. He doesn't pat them on the back and say, keep on, guys. I know it's really rough. Just keep your head down. Instead, he raises the bar and tells them to stick their head up. Look at the 4 things he says in this passage. Be alert and sober so that you can pray. Now, think about that. In the middle of pressure, they are looking everywhere, hiding out there, trying to keep themselves down, right? They are trying to hide. In fact, a lot of people, historians and scholars at this time, say that the early church would have been living in kind of intentional communities and just hiding out in the homes of the more wealthy Christians and keeping their heads down. They would have snuck out at night to get the foods they needed and stuff like that. And as they were doing that, the reminders of what wait for them were in the streets as their friends lay on crosses and poles burning. They would look around and say, there is no hope. It's all breaking loose, right? And so this is the reality in which they're living in. And Peter says, no, guys, don't hide out. Be alert and sober so you can pray. Then he goes on, he says, love each other deeply. Now this is really important because what happens in times that we're under pressure is we tend to become very inward focused. You become worried about your concern, not anyone else's concern. You think your problem is so great that there's no reason you need to love on somebody. In all means, everyone better be loving on me right now because I'm the one that's dealing with this big thing, right? Do you get it? I mean, when you're under pressure and you're feeling the anxieties of life, that's how you are. You become self-focused, right? We all do it. Now, what's interesting about this is Peter's actually referencing a well-known Old Testament passage. And in that is a belief that if you aren't loving each other deeply, Satan's going to get a foothold, and we're going to look at that later. And so he says, in this time where you're not trusting anyone, that's not the way to do it, guys. In this time where you're living under pressure and you're just thinking about your problem before you, do the opposite. Love people and their problems instead. And then he says this, offer hospitality to one another. Now, this is probably one of the hardest challenges in this, and I'll tell you why. The word for hospitality here doesn't mean for you to invite your friends or your family over. We are a very hospitable people because we know how to have people in our homes that we're related to or that we get along with. The word here actually means to be hospitable to strangers. Now, they're in a time of persecution. Without a doubt, at this time, Rome has people undercover infiltrating the church, trying to find out where they're all hiding. In addition to that, they are trying to capture Christians who seem more weak-minded and tell us where you're hiding out, we'll let you and your family live and even give you some money. So in the middle of this, where everyone's like, got to keep our heads down, got to hide, we can't be really friendly with people because they might sell us out and we're going to end up on the street. In the midst of that, Peter says, offer hospitality, right? Host strangers. One another. Philos is there. They're your brothers, your sisters. That you are to be offering hospitality in a time where you are full of distrust. And then he says this, use whatever gift you have received so that you may serve others. And as we're going to see, it really looks at this idea that he is saying whatever thing the Holy Spirit has given to you, regardless of what pressure you are under, live it out. Give it into it. Don't go, I know I'm really good at being a speaker, or I'm really good at the gift of healing, or I'm really good at service, but, I got to pull back right now because I got to work on me. You guys ever do that under pressure? You know, I got to work on me right now. I mean, I just got to make sure I'm healthy, you know. It's kind of like those breakup lines we hear Christians say, like, you know, it's not you, it's me. I gotta date God for a while. We say that to the church sometimes too. Like, you know what, church? I got my own stuff going on right now. I can't serve you. Our pressure has become too great. And Peter is actually reversing that way of thinking. Now, first, let's look at this line by line. Peter says, the end of all things is near. This is where it's really good to understand cultural understandings. We look at that line, and what's the first thing that comes in our mind? The end of all things, right? Like, hey guys, the end of the end is coming. Guess what? Not at all what Peter's saying. Not at all what Peter's saying. In fact, this is a beautiful theological work that Peter is doing because he's using a certain language that is going to bring up a whole bunch of memories of Jesus for them. Throughout the Old Testament, as we look at prophets who are foretelling that when Jesus comes, they say this: when the Messiah comes, it'll be the day of judgment, or it'll be the day of the Lord. Some of them even say, it'll be the end. And then the prophets would say, you will know when the end is upon you because God's presence will be literally there, and God's justice will reign. Those are the two things that mark what it means for the end to be coming. So at the start of Jesus' ministry, he goes and he takes from the prophet Isaiah, and he stands and he unscrolls it in the middle of the temple. And as he looks out at the teachers of the law and those who are gathered, he says, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, for he has anointed me to bring good news to the... And as we just looked at our Remember the Poor series, that word poor there means three things: those who are spiritually lost, those who are marginalized in society, and those who have the least amount of things. Jesus stands in the temple and says, the day of the Lord, the end of ends, the end has come, the day of judgment. I am here, and it is marked because the Spirit, the presence of God is here with me. And then he promises it to his followers. And I've come to bring justice to the poor. In the middle of that temple, he announces the end has come into the present. Think about that. So you and I read this line and go, the end of all things is near. Yay, we're going to get whisked away and live in some gold castle and it'll all be okay. Not at all what Peter's saying. Peter is saying the very reign of God, his presence and his justice is already present. The end of all things is near. When Jesus begins to teach on this, he says, the kingdom of God is at hand. That word at hand means it's literally able to reach out and grab. He says that to his disciples before he's out, you are my last generation, right? In Prophet Joel, that the church in Acts begins to quote, says, in the last days, I will pour out my Spirit on my children. The last days are initiated, or in theological terms, we call that inaugurated eschatology. It literally means the end has come from the end to the present. And this idea in Jewish culture was beautiful because it didn't mean they were going to get out of pain and suffering. It actually meant that when the end comes, they would be vindicated. Right now, they are the problem children in the empire. They are being blamed for the problems of society, and we are headed to a context like that again. And so it's not that they're looking to be whisked away. They're going to stand up and be free. They're going to break free. They're going to feel vindicated. God's presence is going to be consummated. It's even going to be more. That's what they're excited about. They don't think they're going to get whisked away out of pain. They think that God's presence is going to come and join them in the suffering. And that's an important thing because that's what's coming in their mind as they hear the end of all things is near. And we get that because Peter talks about this throughout the time. In fact, he's going to say, it's better for you to judge yourself now in the end of times than when the final judgment comes. So in other words, prepare yourself in these last days. So he says, the end of all things is near. The reign, the presence, the justice of God is present. For a Jewish person, they took hope that God was going to renew all things and give it repurpose. When John gets whisked away into Revelation and he sees his vision, there's a loud voice from the throne that says what? Behold, I am making all things new. The end of all things new in early church history was a grasp of hope. He's in the process. I mean, look out there. That world is so crazy. Our friend Johnny's like dying on a pole out there on fire. But don't worry, Johnny. He's making all things new. It's going to be great. It's going to be awesome. For Peter, N.T. Wright writes, then as the whole early of Christianity, what happened in Jesus' death and resurrection was the ushering in of a whole new world. The end of all things is upon us. That doesn't mean that the space-time universe is about to come to a shuddering halt. That's how you and I read it. That would be actually a vindication of the God who made it. It would be hardly a vindication of the God who made it and loved it. But that God had already begun in Jesus the process of cosmic renewal. I love that idea, that he's making all things, the whole cosmos. The renewal and sign and foretaste of the renewal is in human lives, right? As they saw transformation happening in their community, it was a hope. It was an actual reality of the experience of the end coming into the presence. And they were sharing in that through Jesus' death and resurrection. Theologian Wayne Goodman says it like this: the end of all things is near. It means that the major events in God's plan of redemption have occurred. The end has already come. It's at hand. And now all things are ready for Christ to return and rule. Thus, the curtain could fall at any time. I love that, right? The curtain, the final curtain, that consummation, the end of the last days could fall at any time. And the return of Christ into the end of the age. All things must be ready. All things are ready. God is making all things ready. Make sure that you as the followers of Jesus are ready. And that's the meaning of all things are near. Then Peter says, therefore be alert of sober minds so that you may pray. I love this idea. What do you mean I got to be of sober and alert mind so I can pray? It's easy here. It's saying that Christians should realize that the final consummation of all things could happen at any moment. Don't become distracted. Hey, I'm not saying it's wrong to Netflix and chill. It's not bad to binge watch some movies. But if we give into those sins that he listed in 1 Peter 4 in the beginning, the verse, especially what were they, verses 5 through 7, right? Like, if we fall into those, we become distracted. We begin to build barriers between God and us. We begin to step outside of becoming a better human being for a little bit. And Peter's saying, don't be kept off guard. Those things, they're going to keep you off guard. I mean, there's redemption for you, but those things are going to keep you off guard. The end is near. Be of alert and sober mind so that you can pray. Now, the word for saying there, it means this, or to be of sober mind, it means this: to be self-controlled, having a sound mind, thinking about and clearly evaluating situations. The same word is found throughout the New Testament. In fact, in Luke 8, one of my favorite stories, maybe one of yours too, there's some pigs and a demon-possessed guy, and Jesus does what? He says, hey, a whole bunch of demons in that dude, come out, go into those pigs. They ran over to the Hess farm and then ran off the cliff. Now they're making some bacon down at the bottom of the cliff. You've probably seen some pretty weird looking possessed pigs in your, right? Pigs are a weird. Send them over the cliff. Right? So then, this causes a commotion, right? Anytime a herd of pigs jumps off a cliff squealing and seizing and convulsing, right? It's going to be drawing a crowd. Listen to this. Then the people went out and they saw what had happened. And when they came to Jesus, they found the man from whom the demons had gone out, sitting at Jesus' feet, and he was dressed and in his right mind. He was no longer clouded up by anything else that affected him or distracted him. This is the exact same word that Peter used, to be in right mind. Or, and similarly, when when Paul's writing to Titus, telling him how to pastor his church, he says, and young men, listen to this, similarly encourage young men to be self-controlled, to be alert, to be sober-minded, to be able to step back and evaluate. Right? You and I, under pressure, oh my word, this is crazy. Peter's saying, Oh yeah, this situation, no big deal. The end is already near. I'm good. Like, I know that I'm not falling in trap, that stuff, because the presence of God is with me already. The end has already come. And that's the twist that Peter's putting on him. Right? And then he adds this part on, so that you can pray. This is the part that he adds on that he didn't talk about earlier. And so there's actually this plural sense to the word pray there that the NIV doesn't capture, that you need to be praying every day, that you need to make sure they are, and this is the word that it best describes as effective or appropriate prayer. Prayers that are not self-centered. God, get me out of this mess. Oh my word, Johnny's hanging on the cross. To, Lord, our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come. Bring the end. Bring it in here more, Lord. Right? That's the prayer that Peter is giving them. Prayer here is to have effective and self-controlled prayer. And you feel like God's not present in your pain and problems right now, right? You know, I keep praying, but God's not present. Maybe because it's your mind isn't sober enough. You aren't actually stepping out of your stuff to focus on God's stuff. And he says, above all, love each other deeply, because love covers a multitude of sins. Now, the NIV slips a little bit here with the word above all, because if we'd actually translate that word better, it would mean before all. Before you do anything else, before you think about what you're doing for lunch, before you think about how you're going to get yourself out of this problem you're in, before else, above all, love each other deeply, because love covers a multitude of sins. Now, Paul's twist here is an interesting one. He's saying that when you love somebody so deeply, and when they love you, you overlook their hiccups, their brokenness. You develop true honor. We begin to say, oh, okay, I get, you're messed up there and I'm messed up here. When we love and can overlook that stuff, we form this community, right? Have you ever guys seen the redwoods in California? The redwoods are beautiful, tall trees, hundreds of feet high. It's been around for thousands of years. Their root system is not very deep. What makes them strong is that they intertwine with each other, and they begin to, they buy into each other. And when that happens in community, if your community is this tight, because you're loving each other so tight, there's no weeds coming up through there. There's no other trees coming up through there. And what happens is, in the middle of that, honor protects you from the devil's footholds. It stops from anything else stirring up. In Proverbs 10:12, the well-known proverb Peter's referring to, he says, hatred stirs up conflict, but love covers all wrongs. When we do this, man, there's no stopping us, no matter what pressure we're under. And then he says to offer hospitality to one another without grumbling. Now, we already talked about what it means to offer hospitality to strangers and stuff like that, but Peter puts another twist on it. He says, without grumbling. My favorite part of this word is that it might be actually better translated murmuring. Anytime you act because you feel an obligation to act, but you do this is dumb, I can't believe that my boss made me do this. Like, guess what? Sin. That is sin. He is breaking and saying, guys, offer hospitality as you're under pressure, right? I get it. You might die. You might end up having a Roman soldier come in and kill you all, but offer hospitality to strangers without grumbling. I'm just doing it because God says I got to do it, man. That's not what he wants. That's not what Peter is in. He wants willingness. And then he says this new part that he has not yet touched on anywhere in his letter. Each of you should use whatever gift you have received to serve others. The word for gift there is the word charisma, the same word that shows up in 1 Peter 12. And he says, even though you're under pressure, there is no pulling back. There's no, I got to work on me for a little bit. In the Vineyard, we used to say that when it comes to the church, everybody gets to play. When it comes to the things of the Spirit, everybody gets to play. And it's the same idea that we as Mennonites call the priesthood of all believers. Except when it comes to priesthood of all believers, we kind of get distracted in that language. So today, I'm going to introduce you to the language. Everybody gets to play. Each of you should play. Each of you should get in there and get in the sandbox no matter how much is happening and serve others. Use whatever gift you have, because in doing that, you're being faithful stewards of God's stuff. Don't pull back. In fact, he says, I want you to use that gift so fully that no matter what you do, if you're a speaker, do it like you're actually speaking the words of God. If you're a person who is serving, may you do it with the strength that God gives as if you're actually serving, so that through God, Jesus may praise, and that for the Father, that all glory and power will be with him. Wayne Grudman says, good stewards of God's gifts will not hide it, but employ it for the benefit of others. God's rule for our gifts is that we use them with the confidence that resources expended in faithful stewardship will be replenished by a faithful master. And N.T. Wright says that as we're wrestling with these pains, these problems, these tensions, these troubles in life, here, suffering under pressure is given yet another meaning. Suffering, it seems, brings about a particular transformation of character. Now think about that. Whatever you're wrestling with, same as for the church, whatever you're wrestling with, it brings about a particular transformation of character. It makes you reevaluate your whole life. Now, in the last week, we talked about how when Peter says, like, hey, you're blessed for the trials you're going under, this is what he's talking about. When we realize that what we are wrestling with can help us discover more about who God is and why we need him, it causes transformation in us. Sometimes it happens that those who have potentially a fatal stroke or heart attack make a remarkable recovery. And in such cases, people often say that they've rethought their whole lives and now rely much more clearly. They rely much more clearly on what matters and what doesn't. In the same way that someone who has suffered for the gospel may attain a new kind of clarity. Whatever pressure you're dealing with, look at it as an opportunity for clarity. This seems to they see more sharply the kind of world that sin produces, and they know that they are done with it. Look at the broken world we live in, folks. I don't want to become distracted as I'm wrestling under pressure, because this is the kind of world that produces. And they see far more gloriously, and God's will is not the only thing following. As I said, under pressure, we see more clearly the kind of world that sin produces, and that God desires for everybody and everybody to play in living out God's will, which may require sharing in his suffering to be transformed in his glory. But Jeff, what's that look like practically? Well, it looks like this. God's reign and rule is at work, making all things new. Freedom and vindication is coming. Let your character and mind be clear before the Lord, so that you may pray effective and uninhibited prayers. Love each other deeply so Satan gets no hold in community. Offer hospitality to each other willingly without mumbling. Use the gift that you have received to serve others, so God is worshiped in all things. I invite the worship team forward. And as they come forward, I invite you to stand with me. Why willingly suffer with Christ, right? Why do we need to focus on these things? What does it mean to experience the glory of the Lord? Well, 2 Timothy tells us if we endure, we will also reign with him. If we disown him, he will disown us. Or when Paul writes to the church in Rome, he says, now if we are children, then we are heirs, heirs of God and co-heirs with Christ. And if we indeed share in his sufferings, so that we can also share in his glory. What does it mean to share in his glory? Well, think about this. We're in the middle of summer. We sit out on the porch at night. There's these little bugs that have a butt that lights up really nice and pretty, right? And we get distracted by that. That is a beautiful thing. Now, think. If God can take a pesky little bug and make it such a beautiful thing by lighting up its butt, what can he do with us if we surrender, if we live into these things in such a way that we share in his glory? We'll have more than little green butts that glow. People are going to be transformed around us, but it means living out These things Peter says to us under pressure. Let the lightning bug be a reminder to you this week of how to be under pressure.